My name is Beatrix Emo. I'm a practicing architect, as Arzu said. I'm a digital initiative fellow in Zurich, and I also have two research affiliations, one with the Institute Urban Landscape at az-yet-unbuilt and the other with the Chair of Cognitive Science at ETH Zurich. And the title of my talk today is Designing for the User, the Potential of Extended Reality for Architectural Design. So this is a little bit more about my mixed background. I took the decision after my PhD in architecture to join a cognitive science group, which is an applied cognitive science group. And my role there is to tackle questions about how individuals perceive spaces, built spaces, so whether indoors or outdoors. And as Arzu said, I also have my own company called Spatialist Arch. So this is the outline of my talk today, and I'm going to start off with a little bit of background on spatial cognition for architectural design. So cognitive science is the science of the mind, and the most fundamental assumption is that the mind is an information processor. And so in the cognitive sciences, it's an empirical discipline, and that's a baseline that's quite important to me. What is cognition? There are various types of definitions. There's the narrow definition that it's about the conscious processes of thinking. And then there are broader definitions that encompass many more different types of processes. And what is cognitive science? A number of different disciplines deal with cognition, implicitly or explicitly. Cognitive science is a relatively younger discipline, established around 1976, and it sees itself as an interdiscipline, so it combines methods and ideas from numerous different disciplines, such as linguistics, neuroscience, philosophy, psychology, anthropology, AI, and education. And my knowledge of cognitive science is very much embedded in the empirical side. So I work with psychologists and neuroscientists in my group very closely. So cognition is understood as having two parts, a representation part and a process part. So the mental representation and the process by which we can understand that. And both elements are not independent of each other. It's kind of like a basic background of cognitive science. This is the professor of cognitive science at ETH Zurich, Professor Christoph Hölscher, in whose group I have done a 6-year postdoc. And I joined that group because I am interested in understanding how individuals experience the spaces that architects design. And I like this graphic very much because it comes from the 60s, Gordon Cullen's Townscape. And as Tobias also mentioned in his talk, if you were present at the first presentation this afternoon, a lot of architecture competitions and visualizations happen at the bird's eye view. But what I really care about is how the individual perceives and experiences the space when they're in situ. And there's a very nice link between cognition and architecture, which is based around the theory of the ecological approach to visual perception, as described in J.J. Gibson's book. And he talks about the concept of affordances. So when architects design something, they're building something that's going to be used in the future by people, and an architect envisages how that might work. And J.J. Gibson describes this concept of affordances, which is something that's designed affords a certain use. And there's been a lot of work done linking these two seemingly very different domains, so spatial cognition on the one hand and architecture on the other. Here I'm showing the proceedings of a 2011 conference which was the second conference in the series called Spatial Cognition for Architectural Design. There's also a very nice editorial in the journal Environment and Planning B, which reviews, published in 2012, which reviews studies linked with spatial cognition and built environment research. And I've also included editorial that I was involved in, entitled Design, Cognition and Behavior, really focus on the usability of the built environment. And usability is not something that an architecture student might learn about in their studies. And the type of research that we do at the Chair of Cognitive Science that's relevant for this spatially or for architecture is empirical. So it's all based around an experiment design, having participants respond in some way to some case study, whether that's in the real world, or today I'm going to talk more about the virtual world studies that I've been involved in. And this slide is sometimes problematic for practicing architects because it's not part of the flow, shall we say, of how an architecture project evolves. But from a psychologist perspective, what they find useful is that you take a case study, so a space, and you have some participants respond in some way. That could be a preference judgment. Do you prefer this space to that space? It could be a navigation task where you record how long, how much time it takes someone to reach a destination, or something like that. I wanted to show this because the type of experiments that we do are based in different types of reality. So we have virtual reality. I'm going to show a project done in mixed reality using the HoloLens. We've also done some augmented reality stuff at the chair, projects at the chair, which I'm not going to talk about too much. And I'm going to end my talk comparing what we find in the lab with what we find in the so-called real world. So the first project I'm going to talk about is the HoloLens project, which is entitled Mixed Reality Tools in Architectural Education, Exploring Buildings from the Inside Out. So Tobias showed made a great pitch for why HoloLens and mixed reality is useful for planners and designers. And I was very impressed by the seeming positive feedback of the people, for example, in the video that you showed, Tobias, when the participants were on site and visualizing the proposed project in situ. So we decided to apply HoloLens to architecture theory seminar at ETH Zurich. And what we wanted to show was that what the benefit is of experiencing a building or a space from the egocentric perspective. And we hoped that by putting on a HoloLens and walking around in a space, they would be able to communicate their design process better and understand their design intentions better. And on the right, you have a figure that underlines the type of teaching that I try to implement with my architecture students, which is the tools, cognitive tools or evaluative tools that we teach them is really meant to feed back into the design process. So the architecture students are designing and they're making an informed decision based on their findings from different kind of simulations and models. And I thought that Tobias showed that very nicely, that non-experts gain a lot from this kind of immersive visualization of the space. But the question is, how much does an architecture student learn? So we tested it in an architecture theory seminar. It was done together with my colleague, Professor Andri Gerber. And the seminar is entitled Experiments on the Spatial Perception and Spatial Cognition of Architects. And we had the opportunity to use HoloLens in 2 semesters. So on the left, you see the poster of the first semester. This was a semester that was somewhat plagued by the technical issues I discussed with Tobias earlier. And on the right, you have the somewhat more successful follow-up semester. So in the first semester, what we did is we prepared 10 case studies that were classic architectural references. Famous buildings from the history of architecture. And what we asked the students to do is to explain how you experience the building by walking through it. So they created a 3D model of the space, and they showed the class how you would experience that space, and then they proposed a design modification. And then at the end of the seminar, the students were able to show how the experience changed in the design modification. So this is bringing in the feedback loop and this ability of HoloLens to visualize the space. We had problems syncing all of the HoloLenses so that every student was able to walk around independently, which we resolved by having one of the students presenting, just streaming that onto the into the classroom so that everybody could see the kind of walkthrough done by one person. And in the second semester, what we did is we asked students to develop their own spatial abilities test. So Arzu's talked a little bit about different types of spatial abilities tests. For example, she talked about the water level test by Piaget and the mental rotation test. So these are types of spatial ability tests. And what we asked the students to do is to develop a new one. And then other sets of students had to complete that test, either as paper pencil or using HoloLens. So we documented to what extent the use of mixed reality improved people's ability to successfully complete the task. The reason why we structured the seminar in that way is because it was linked to a project on spatial abilities of architecture students that I was also involved in, led by Professor Andri Gerber, and that has now come to a close. An SNF project, which is about trying to fully understand what it is about architecture students that makes their spatial abilities improved to other sets of students. So here is one example of this new spatial abilities test that is one of the outcomes of the project. And there's a very nice book that has been published on the project. And I invite anyone who is interested on the spatial abilities of architecture students to take a look at the book or write to me and I can discuss that further. And a bit like Tobias said, there has to be a reason for using HoloLens. So I think a few years ago, it was a great gadget. If you could get hold of one and implement it, fantastic. You could kind of test the boundaries. But now I think quite a few people have used it. And the question is really, does it suit your purposes? So we really wanted to test the potential of augmented reality for architectural education. At the time, we were the first seminar to implement HoloLens in an architecture seminar. And now there's a whole group at ETH that's applying HoloLens to all different types of departments. So that's fantastic. So like Tobias said, you have the ability for several people to be inside the same virtual space using the sync capabilities, although we had some problems with that. We wanted to collect data on how students' experience of the space changed, whether when they were immersed using a HoloLens or not. We ended up using SketchUp Viewer for HoloLens as a plugin. As the title says, this is a software that only allows you to view what you've done in the 3D modeling software SketchUp in HoloLens. So it doesn't allow you to edit it. The students found that a bit limited. Architecture is a discipline that's very visual, and in terms of graphics, it's probably one of the disciplines that relies so heavily on the ability to render and visualize stuff virtually, that it's very developed. And so HoloLens, if you're just viewing what you've already done on the desktop, it didn't seem to add that much. But in the updated version of the HoloLens, you can now be much more adaptive and edit your designs. Or like Tobias showed, it lends itself very nicely to scripting your own software and being able to work with it that way. So this is a short video that we did about the project, and I will just let it run and talk over it. So you can find this video online also. So the HoloLens is a mixed reality device, which means you see the classroom and you place the objects on top. Feeling. And this was one of the spaces that the students designed. And these avatars here are the other people who are viewing the model. Scale very easily on HoloLens. Pan zoom is also incredibly easy, which is fantastic. These are the two seminars that we used it in. And I've purposely muted the you see it online. There's a comment. You just have some more images of the classroom. This is the first semester where the person is visualizing the image. I'm very grateful to Innovator and Let at DTH Zurich for supplying the HoloLens, and I'm going to go on in my talk to discuss why we did not apply virtual reality or what the benefit of VR is to mixed reality. So that's the next part of my talk. I'm going to move on to talk about a virtual reality behavioral study based around a model of Oropale that we created. And the project is about how do people perceive urban density. And the research question is people's rating of urban density related to crowdedness? So I care a lot about this project, but for the purposes of today's talk, I'm going to do my best to really focus on the extended reality aspects of it. And what I'm very proud of is the virtual reality model of Oropale that we produced. But a little bit about the project. So there's been a lot of literature on how people experience density. For example, the exhibition at the Swiss Architecture Museum, which you can see the poster of in the bottom left. A whole array of very interesting books, 3 of which I depict here. A fantastic study by the Amt für Raumentwicklung, and a recurring survey done by Joel Simmerli, Raumgesellschaft. So my project has 3 parts. The first part is about how do we define perceived urban density. The second and third part are all about is the perception of urban density a factor of crowdedness. And part 2 is testing this in VR, and part 3 is testing this in a real world study. So only briefly on part 1, what we did is we created a questionnaire with images of the city of Zurich, and we asked people to say which location is more dense. So preference judgment, a binary preference judgment, left or right. And we did a segmentation analysis of the images to see how much sky there was in each image, how much walkable surface, how much green, how many people, and we correlated that. What we found was that 4 factors were held to be the most important: presence of green, presence of sky, presence of walkable space, and how far you can see in the distance, so depth of view. So those were the findings of the part 1. Part 2 is the study that I'm going to talk more about in a second. That's the focus of this part of my presentation. And I'm going to end my talk today comparing a little bit with part 3, which is the study in the real world. So onto the VR study. What we did is we created a virtual model of Europa, and we created a route. And participants were asked to walk along the route, and at the indicated locations numbered here, they had to say how dense they thought the location was on a rating scale from 1 to 9. And there were 2 conditions, a rush hour and a non-rush hour condition. So this is a virtual study, so we populated, for the rush hour condition, we populated the virtual environment with people, seemingly realistic avatars, sometimes doing funny movements, funny dance movements. And for the non-rush hour condition, it was very few people or almost no people at all. For those of you who are not based in Switzerland, I should add that Europa Allee is a fantastic new development, very close to the main station of Zurich. And it lends itself nicely to this study because it has a very high change of number of people present in the spaces according to rush hour because of its proximity to the main station. So at the 6 locations, participants had to rate. They were able to move the view of the virtual environment around so they could have the full 360-degree view of the space, and then they had to rate how dense they thought the location was from 0 to 9. And here's another video. And what this video shows is basically the virtual model like we created it. We chose not to use photographic textures because that was easier to implement and ran more efficiently. And despite it not having photographic textures, I think it's gives a good understanding of the space. So I'm very happy with the 3D model. So this is just a fly through the virtual model. Here you see a condition of rush hour, and it's just changed to a condition of no rush hour. So you can see that there are street segments, no people present at all, and in the other case, people are present. So I'll just let this run a second so you can see the full example. Right, for those of you who don't know, the area is the train tracks, and that marks the boundary of our environment. And participants had a first-person view of the environment, so this video is purely for the purposes of visualizing the portraying the virtual model. There you see some people doing funny dances. For those of you who are interested, we imported the model into Unity game engine, Unity 3D, and we collected the participant data here. So this is the final street of the route. This is kind of a main public square here. And I think I will move on. The video is also online on my website, on the project website. And what we found, Arzu did a great job of giving us all of her data and statistics. I've purposefully excluded those, but what we found is that people do rate urban density as a factor of crowdedness, both in virtual reality and in the real world. So the title of the final part of my talk is VR versus real. How does it compare? How ecologically valid is it to conduct a experiment in virtual reality when you're talking about a space that actually also exists? So Europa Allee is a new development for the city of the Zurich. It's a very large development. It's in a prime location right next to the main train station, but it has often been criticized for having like a sterile feel, so not being populated as much as it should. The supporters of the Europa Allee development say that time will tell, that you need to give the neighborhood time to evolve, and then it's going to feel just as lived in as the other neighborhoods of Zurich. And the critics of the development say that it's already existed for a long time, and yet it still has a kind of sterile feel. So what we did is talking about the experimental design, we repeated one-to-one what we had done in virtual reality in the real world. So we had the same route. Participants were met at point 1 and were conducted along the same route in the case study, and at the same locations they had to rate, again the same rating scale from 0 to 9, we had two conditions, rush hour and non-rush hour. This was, we collected data ahead of time to see what times of day and which days we can expect to find peak hour and non-peak hour. And this was then controlled for during the experiment by having participants wear a GoPro, where we can go back and check the average number of people present along the route, so we can have bands and make sure that the rush hour group is really a crowded scenario for each participant, and likewise for the non-rush hour condition. And here I'm showing two pictures of the Europa Allee, two photographs that we took. The left one is the non-rush hour condition. It's showing fewer people. And on the right, you have a photograph of one of the locations in the rush hour condition. You can see more people. And it's tricky from an experimenter's perspective to say that to validate doing a virtual reality experiment of an existing space, because you're always faced with this conundrum of how can you relate the experience of people in the real world with a model of that space in virtual reality. And that's something that, as an architect doing empirical research in mixed reality, is something that I'm confronted with often. But what I can say in this project is that I was quite happy with the way the virtual model turned out. The way we asked participants for the virtual study whether they recognized the space, and how confident they were that that space was the space that was the Europa Allee. And we ended up finding that same in the virtual study as with the real world study, people's ratings of perceived urban density correlated with the presence of people. So that's the end of my talk. I've been lightning fast, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.